The year was 1884, and the wind across the high plains of Wyoming had a loneliness that seeped into a man's bones. For Nathaniel Prescott, it was a familiar ache, a phantom limb of sorrow that had become as much a part of him as the calluses on his hands. His ranch was a testament to his grief, a sprawling expanse of dust and struggling grama grass bordered by fences that were always in need of mending. He owned a handful of cattle, gaunt creatures that mirrored his own lean frame, and a cabin that had been built for two but had housed only one for 3 long years. The silence within its log walls was a living thing, heavy with the ghost of a lullaby never sung and the echo of a woman's laughter that had been stolen by a fever and a childbirth gone wrong. Nathaniel's life had shrunk to the size of his chores. He rose before the sun painted the eastern sky in bruised shades of purple and rose, his movements economical and devoid of wasted energy. He checked his cattle, patched the endless wounds in his fences, and drew water from a well that seemed to be getting deeper and more reluctant with each passing season. He was too poor to hire help, and too poor, the townsfolk whispered, to ever hope for a wife. They saw him on his rare trips into town for flour and salt, a man walled off by a quiet dignity that they mistook for pride. They did not see the way he still laid a hand on the empty side of his cot at night, a muscle memory of reaching for his Mary, only to find the cold, unyielding wool of the blanket. His stasis was one of resigned survival. He did not hope for more because hope was a dangerous currency he could no longer afford. The past was a locked room inside him, and he was the sole keeper of its key, ensuring the door remained shut. The future was just a series of sunrises, each one demanding the same labor as the last, a monotonous rhythm that kept him from thinking too much. The land itself was his companion, a vast, indifferent canvas on which his solitude was painted. It held no judgment, offered no comfort, and simply existed, much like him. He was a man whittled down to his essential parts, work, memory, and a silence so profound it had its own sound. It was on a day when the sky was a sheet of flawless, searing blue that the rhythm was broken. A disturbance on the horizon, not a dust devil or a stray herd, but something organized, something with purpose. Nathaniel stopped his work, his hand resting on a fence post, and watched from the gentle slope of the hill where he stood. A long procession of people and horses, moving with a fluid grace that spoke of long travel. They were not settlers, not a posse. As they drew closer, the distinctive forms of Native American riders became clear. Cheyenne. His hand instinctively went to the worn handle of the pistol at his hip, a gesture of ingrained caution rather than aggression. They did not approach his cabin directly, but stopped a respectful distance away, a silent assembly of over 100 people, their ponies stirring the dust. 4 riders detached themselves from the group and advanced. One was clearly the leader, a man whose age was etched onto his face in lines of authority and wisdom. He wore a simple buckskin shirt, but his presence was more commanding than any general's uniform. He was flanked by 3 young women, each riding with an easy confidence that seemed to make them one with their mounts. Nathaniel descended the hill slowly, his heart a tight, wary drum against his ribs. He met them at the edge of his hard-won, dusty yard. The leader raised a hand in peace. His voice, when he spoke, was a low rumble like distant thunder. "I am Vokin," he said, his English measured and clear. "My people have traveled far. The bluecoats push us from the lands of our fathers onto soil that will not feed our children." Nathaniel nodded, saying nothing. It was a story he knew, a tragedy playing out across the entire frontier. He waited. Vokin's gaze was direct, seeing past the grime and weariness on Nathaniel's face, seeming to peer directly into the hollow spaces within him. "I have seen your land. It is poor, but there is water. It is a place a man could build from. I see you are alone." He gestured behind him to the 3 women. "These are my daughters. Mesa, the eldest, wise in the ways of the earth. Neva, who sees the spirit in the snow and the stone, and Soteo, who stands in the wind and does not bend." The women met his gaze without flinching. The eldest, Mesa, had a steady, assessing look. Neva's eyes were distant, as if seeing something beyond the harsh sunlight. The youngest, Soteo, had a fire in her dark eyes, a spark of defiance that seemed to challenge the very air she breathed. "A man alone cannot hold this much land," Vokin continued, his proposal laid out with the stark simplicity of the prairie itself. "And my people cannot survive without a place to anchor themselves. I offer you a trade, a kinship. You will take one of my daughters as your wife. She will be a partner to you, and her people will be your allies. We will have the right to graze our herds on the far edges of your land, to hunt in the hills. And you," he paused, letting the weight of his next words settle, "will have a dowry. 1,000 horses, enough to make you a king in this territory." Nathaniel stared, speechless. The sheer audacity of the offer was like a physical blow. 1,000 horses. It was a fortune beyond his wildest, most long-forgotten dreams. It was a lifeline, a kingdom, but the price was the one thing he had sworn he would never consider again: a wife, a woman to fill the space that Mary had left, a presence in the crushing silence of his home. It felt like a betrayal, a sacrilege, yet his gaze drifted over his dilapidated barn, his skeletal cattle, the parched earth. He was not surviving, he was slowly dying. He looked from the chief to the three women. His mind, accustomed to the simple calculus of survival, was reeling. This was not a business transaction, it was a remaking of his entire world. He saw the desperation in Vokin's offer, the last, best gamble of a leader trying to save his people, and in that he recognized a mirror of his own quiet desperation. "The choice will not be yours or mine," Vokin said, as if reading his thoughts. "It will be theirs." He spoke to his daughters in the fluid, musical tones of their own language. Maisa looked toward the horizon, her expression thoughtful, considering the future of her people. Neva closed her eyes for a moment, as if listening for an answer from the land itself. But it was Soteo who acted. With a sharp, decisive movement, she nudged her pony forward a single step. Her chin was high, her eyes still blazing with that untamable fire. It was not a look of affection or eagerness, it was a look of duty, of sacrifice, of a warrior stepping into the breach. She had made her choice. Vokin nodded once, a deep and somber acknowledgement. The deal was struck. Within the hour, the world had changed. The Cheyenne band moved on, flowing like a river toward the distant hills, leaving behind a sea of horses that filled Nathaniel's valley. The thunder of their hooves was the sound of his new reality, and standing alone in the yard, a small bundle of her possessions at her feet, was Soteo. She watched her family disappear, her posture rigid, a lone, stark figure against the vast, empty landscape. Nathaniel stood on his porch, the owner of 1,000 horses and a wife he did not know, feeling poorer and more adrift than he ever had before. The first days were a lesson in silence. It was a different kind of silence from the one Nathaniel had known. His had been born of absence, a hollow echo. This new silence was one of presence, a thick, charged atmosphere of two strangers orbiting each other in a shared, confined space. He had gestured toward the cabin, toward the main room and the small bedroom where Mary's things still sat in a dust-covered trunk. "You can take the house," he had offered, the words clumsy in his throat. Soteo had looked at the dark doorway of the cabin, then at the sturdy but rough-hewn barn. Without a word, she had picked up her bundle and walked to the barn, choosing for herself a clean, empty stall meant for a prized stallion. She swept it clean with a broken branch and laid out her bedroll. The message was clear. She would accept the terms of the bargain, but she would not invade his space, his life, his memories. She was a presence on his land, but not yet in his home. A wall, invisible but solid, stood between the house and the barn. Their communication was stripped to its barest essentials, a language of gesture and necessity. He would leave a plate of food jerky, beans, the plain fare of his bachelor existence on a crate outside the barn door. Hours later, the plate would be returned, wiped clean. He saw her moving through the massive herd of horses, her touch gentle, her voice a low murmur that calmed the most skittish among them. She was not idle, not a waiting bride. She was a keeper of the herd, her purpose as clear and defined as his own. He watched her from a distance, this woman who was his wife in name only. He observed the way she moved, with an economy of motion that spoke of a life lived outdoors, a body strong and capable. She found a spring he had long thought dry and cleared it, creating a new watering hole for the horses. She foraged on the hillsides, returning with greens and roots he did not recognize. She was a part of the landscape in a way he, for all his years on it, had never been. He was its keeper, she was its kin. One evening, a storm rolled in, the sky turning a malevolent grey-green. The wind howled like a thing grieving, and rain came down in solid, blinding sheets. The temperature plummeted. He stood on his porch, watching the barn, the thin planks offering little protection against the fury of the storm. It was one thing for her to choose the barn on a calm night. It was another for her to freeze in it. His conscience, a thing he thought long dormant, pricked at him. He crossed the muddy yard, the wind tearing at his coat, and pushed open the heavy barn door. She was huddled in the far corner of the stall, wrapped in her blanket, her frame small against the vast, dark space. The wind found every crack in the walls, whistling a mournful tune. He did not speak, simply gestured with his head back toward the cabin. She looked at him, her dark eyes unreadable in the gloom, then gave a single, almost imperceptible shake of her head. Stubborn. He felt a flash of irritation, followed by a wave of something else, grudging respect. He sighed, the sound lost in the wind, and left, returning moments later with two of his own thickest wool blankets and a lantern. He set them down just outside her stall, along with a small stack of firewood. He then went to the main area of the barn and started a small, contained fire in a metal bucket he used for heating branding irons. It was a risk, but it was better than leaving her to the cold. He did not look at her again as he left, pulling the barn door tight against the storm. He had offered what he could, a measure of warmth, without demanding she cross the invisible line she had drawn. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of wet sage and ozone. The blankets he had left were neatly folded outside her stall. On top of them was a small, intricately carved bird, fashioned from a piece of scrap wood. He picked it up. The details were perfect, from the fanned tail to the tiny, sharp beak. It was not a thank you, it was not a gift, it was a statement, an exchange, a piece of her skill for his provision. They were still balancing the scales of their transaction, a silent accounting between two worlds. The sheer number of horses necessitated cooperation. 1,000 animals could not be managed by one person, or even two working in isolation. They created a new routine, unspoken but mutually understood. At dawn, he would handle the cattle and the fences near the cabin, while she would take the first watch over the vast equine herd, her silhouette a familiar sight on a distant ridge. In the afternoons, their paths would cross as he rode out to relieve her or to help move a section of the herd to fresh grazing land. Words remained sparse, but a new language began to form between them, the language of shared work. He learned to read the subtle flick of her wrist that indicated which way the herd should turn, the low whistle she used to call a wandering stallion back into line. She, in turn, learned the meaning of his steady, patient presence, the way he could anticipate a problem with a fence line or a water source before it became a crisis. They were two solitary people working in tandem, their individual efforts weaving together into a functional whole. Their meals changed too. He was a man who cooked to stay alive, his diet consisting of whatever was easiest. One afternoon, he returned to the cabin to find a small pile of wild onions and flat, broad-leafed greens on his porch. There was no note, no explanation. He hesitated, then took them inside and added them to the pot of beans simmering on the stove. That night, The food had a depth of flavor it had never possessed before, a taste of the living earth. It became a quiet ritual. She would leave her foraged offerings, and he would incorporate them into their shared meal, which they still ate separately, he in his cabin, she in her barn. But now the food itself was a point of connection, a shared taste on their solitary tongues. A month bled into the next. The fierce heat of summer softened into the golden melancholy of autumn. The land changed, and something was changing between them too. The silence was less of a wall and more of a space, a quiet territory they were beginning to share. He found himself looking for her figure on the horizon, the knot of tension in his chest loosening slightly when he saw she was there, a steady, constant presence. One day, he was repairing a section of fence on the far pasture when his horse, a normally placid gelding, spooked at a rattlesnake. The horse reared, and Nathaniel, caught off guard, was thrown hard. He landed badly, his leg twisting beneath him with a sickening crack of bone. A wave of white-hot pain washed over him, and the world went dark at the edges. He lay in the dust, grit in his teeth, the pain a relentless, searing fire in his shin. He tried to push himself up, but the leg wouldn't hold him. He was miles from the cabin, utterly alone, or so he thought. He did not know how long he lay there before a shadow fell over him. He looked up to see Sotayo standing there, her expression for once unmasked, showing a flicker of alarm. She had seen his riderless horse galloping back toward the herd and had come to investigate. She knelt beside him, her examination of his leg swift and practiced. Her touch was firm but surprisingly gentle. "Broken," she said. It was the first time she had spoken a full word to him in weeks. Getting him back to the ranch was an agonizing ordeal. She used her own strength and his one good leg to haul him onto her pony. Every jolt sent waves of nausea and pain through him. Back at the cabin, she helped him onto his cot, her face set in a mask of concentration. He expected her to leave him then, to retreat back to the safety of her barn, her duty done. She did not. Instead, she went to work. She took his sharpest knife and, without a word, cut his pant leg away. She built up the fire. She gathered smooth, straight branches from the woodpile and tore strips from one of his cleaner shirts. With a skill that spoke of long practice, she set the bone. The pain was excruciating, a blinding flash that made him cry out, but her hands were steady and sure. She splinted the leg tightly, her movements efficient and devoid of sentiment. For the next 2 weeks, he was a prisoner on his cot, and the wall between the cabin and the barn dissolved out of pure necessity. She moved into his house. Not into his room, but into the main living space, sleeping on a bedroll by the fire. She tended to him, managed the ranch, and cared for the 1,000 horses by herself. She brought him food, changed the dressing on his leg, and kept the fire going. Her presence filled the cabin, no longer an intrusion, but a quiet, constant hum of life in the silent rooms. In the long hours of his convalescence, he watched her. He saw the weariness that settled in her shoulders late at night. He saw her tracing the patterns of her tribe onto the dusty floor with her finger, a look of profound homesickness crossing her features for just a moment before her mask of composure slipped back into place. One evening, as she was adding wood to the fire, he spoke, his voice raspy from disuse. "Your name," he said. "The chief, your father, he said it means, stands in the wind." She paused, her back to him, and for a long moment he thought she would not answer. Then she turned, her face softened by the firelight. "It is the name of the lone tree that grows on the highest butte near our winter camp," she said, her voice low. "The winds there can strip the bark from a pine, but that one tree has never fallen. It bends, it survives." He thought of her, standing alone in his yard after her family had left, a lone figure against the vastness. He thought of her choosing the barn, of her facing down his silence, of her managing this entire ranch on her own. She did not just stand in the wind, she was the wind. A deep, unfamiliar pang of guilt twisted in his gut. He had taken her as payment for a debt, a piece in a transaction to save his own failing life. He had never once considered what the cost had been to her. "You gave up your home," he said, the words an inadequate apology. "For this." He gestured around the small, dark cabin. She looked at him, her gaze direct and unflinching. "My people have a home for the winter. The horses have grazing land. My father's bargain was a good one." She spoke of it as a strategist, not a victim. In that moment, his perception of her shifted completely. She was not a girl he had acquired. She was a woman who had made a choice, a sacrifice born of strength and loyalty, not submission. He had been so lost in the geography of his own grief that he had failed to see the map of hers. He saw the strength it took for her to be here, in this alien place, with this silent, broken man. And for the first time since Mary's death, Nathaniel Prescott felt a profound and humbling connection to another living soul. The ice that had encased his heart for 3 years began to show the faintest of cracks. The first snow of winter came early, a thick, wet blanket that muffled the world in white. The leg had healed, leaving him with a limp that would likely be his companion for life, a physical reminder of his dependency on her. The incident had changed their dynamic. The wall was gone, and in its place was a fragile, tentative bridge. She still slept by the fire, but they now ate their meals at the same table, the silence between them more comfortable, punctuated by the small sounds of living. He learned more about her in small, quiet moments. He learned that she had a healer's knowledge of herbs, that she could predict the weather by the behavior of the birds, and that she possessed a quiet, dry wit that would surface unexpectedly, a brief flash of humor that would light up her serious face. In turn, she learned things about him. She saw the way his hands, though rough, could be gentle when mending a leather strap. She saw the deep sorrow that still lived in his eyes when he thought she was not looking. She never asked about it, but she knew it was there, a ghost that shared their cabin. As the snow deepened, they were forced to make a trip to town for supplies they could not forage or make. The 1,000 horses, now a recognized part of the Prescott Ranch, had made him a man of note. He was no longer just the poor, grieving widower. He was a man of substance, a mystery. He loaded the wagon, and Soteo, wrapped in a thick buffalo robe he had given her, climbed up beside him. It was her first time in the town, and her first time being presented, officially, as his wife. The town of Redemption was a collection of raw timber buildings huddled against the vast whiteness of the plains. As their wagon rolled down the main street, curtains twitched in windows. Heads turned. The whispers followed them like a trail of smoke. When Nathaniel pulled up in front of Hale's Mercantile, a group of men loafing on the porch fell silent, their eyes fixed on Soteo with a mixture of curiosity and open hostility. Nathaniel felt a familiar defensiveness rise in him, but it was different now. It was not for himself, but for her. He helped her down from the wagon, his hand briefly touching her arm, a small protective gesture. He could feel her tense beside him, her back straight, her chin high, as she faced the silent, staring men. Inside, the store was warm and smelled of coffee, leather, and dried apples. Mr. Hale, a portly man with a perpetually sour expression, stood behind the counter. His eyes flickered from Nathaniel to Soteo and back again, his lips tightening in disapproval. "Prescott," he said, his tone clipped. "Heard you came into some fortune." He said the word fortune as if it were an accusation. "I need flour, salt, coffee, and cartridges," Nathaniel said, ignoring the jibe. Hale's gaze lingered on Sotero. "Don't serve her kind in here," he said, his voice low and venomous. "You want your goods, you have her wait outside with the horses, where she belongs." The air in the store grew thick and cold. Soteo did not flinch, her expression unreadable, but Nathaniel felt a tremor of rage go through him, hot and cleansing. For 3 years he had been a ghost, moving through this town and his life without passion or anger. He had accepted their pity and their judgment with mute indifference. But this insult, aimed at the woman who had set his bone, managed his ranch, and shared his table, was an insult he would not swallow. He placed both of his hands flat on the counter and leaned forward, his voice quiet, but carrying the deadly weight of a coiled snake. "Her name is Nathaniel Prescott. She is my wife. And you will show her the respect that name commands. Now, you will fill my order, or I will take my business, and the business of every man who works my herd from now on, to the next town." The threat was not idle. The Prescott Ranch, with its 1,000 horses, was suddenly the biggest enterprise in the county. The loss of its business would cripple the mercantile. Hale's face flushed a blotchy red. He looked from Nathaniel's cold, determined eyes to the silent, defiant woman beside him. He saw he had misjudged the man. This was not the broken widower he remembered. This was someone new. With ill grace, Hale turned and began to gather the supplies, slamming them onto the counter. The other customers in the store watched, their expressions ranging from disapproval to a new, grudging respect. Nathaniel had drawn a line in the sand. He paid for his goods, loaded the wagon, and helped Soteo back onto the seat, all under the watchful, resentful eyes of the townsfolk. As they rode out of town, the silence in the wagon was different yet again. It was the silence of a battle fought and won together. He glanced at her. Her face was turned away, looking out at the endless expanse of snow, but he saw the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. "Thank you," she said, her voice so soft he almost missed it. "He had no right," Nathaniel replied, his hands tight on the reins. He had not done it for a thank you. He had done it because, in that moment, in that store, her dignity had felt as important as his own. He had defended her, and in doing so, he had defended the new life that was beginning to take root in the barren soil of his old one. They were no longer just two parties in a transaction. They were a family, forged not by ceremony or affection, but by the shared fire of a common enemy. The stand in town had consequences. The resentment in redemption festered, nourished by envy and prejudice. Whispers grew louder, speculating that Nathaniel had stolen the horses, that the Cheyenne woman had bewitched him. Hale's son, a bitter young man named Walter, with none of his father's grudging pragmatism, began to stir up trouble, talking loudly in the saloon about the savage at the Prescott Ranch and the fortune that rightly belonged to white men. A week later, the threat materialized. It was near dusk, the sky a deep, bruised plum color, when Nathaniel saw them coming. A group of about a dozen riders, dark shapes moving against the snow, their intent clear in the aggressive way they approached the cabin. He recognized Walter Hale at their head. "Soteo inside," he ordered, his voice sharp. He grabbed his rifle from its pegs by the door. "Bar the door and stay away from the windows." She looked from him to the approaching riders, her eyes dark with understanding. She did not argue. She slipped inside the cabin, and he heard the heavy wooden bar fall into place. He stood on the porch, his rifle held loosely at his side, a lone figure waiting for the confrontation. His heart was pounding, but his mind was strangely calm. He was no longer defending just land and property. He was defending his home. Walter Hale and his men pulled up in a half-circle, their horses stamping nervously in the snow. Their faces, flushed with cheap whiskey and self-righteous anger, were ugly in the fading light. "Prescott," Walter shouted, "we've come for what's ours. This land, these horses. They belong to folks like us, not to be squandered on some Indian witch. Send her out." "This is my land," Nathaniel said, his voice even and cold. "And that is my wife. You are not welcome here. Turn around and ride out." A few of the men shifted uncomfortably, but Walter laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "We're not asking, we're telling. We'll drive off the herd and burn you out if we have to." He raised his own rifle, a clear challenge. Nathaniel raised his rifle to match. The standoff was absolute, a dozen men against one. He knew he could not win a direct fight. He was buying time, but for what, he did not know. The air grew taut, stretched to the breaking point. A single twitch, a single shot, would unleash hell. And then a sound began, low and deep, a rumbling that seemed to come from the earth itself. It grew rapidly, a thunder that shook the ground. The men's horses started to whinny and roll their eyes in terror. From behind the low rise to the east, a torrent of living flesh appeared. Hundreds of horses, a wave of pure power and panic, were stampeding directly toward the flank of Walter's group. It was not a blind stampede. It was directed, controlled. At the head of the wave, riding bareback on a powerful black stallion, was Sotao. She had not stayed in the cabin. She had slipped out the back, a shadow against the snow, and had done the one thing they would never expect. She had unleashed the very source of their envy as a weapon against them. The men's formation shattered. Their own mounts, caught in the primal fear of the stampede, became uncontrollable. Riders were thrown, horses bolted, and the orderly line of aggressors dissolved into a chaos of screaming men and terrified animals. Walter Hale, his face a mask of disbelief and fear, struggled to control his horse as the equine tide swept past them. In that moment of chaos, Nathaniel acted. He did not shoot to kill. He fired once, the bullet striking the rifle from Walter's hand, sending it spinning into a snowdrift. He strode forward, his limp forgotten, and dragged the stunned young man from his saddle. He pressed the muzzle of his rifle against Walter's chest. "Get out," Nathaniel snarled, his voice raw with fury. "Get your men and get off my land. If I ever see any of you here again, I will not be so merciful." Humiliated, terrified, and defeated not by bullets but by a force of nature they could not comprehend, the men gathered themselves and fled, disappearing back into the twilight from which they came. The thunder of the stampede subsided as Sotao, with a series of sharp calls, expertly turned the herd and brought them to a milling halt. The silence that fell in the aftermath was profound. The snow was churned and scarred, the only evidence of the battle. Nathaniel released Walter's horse and let the younger Hale scramble away into the darkness. He stood there, breathing heavily, the adrenaline slowly draining away, leaving him trembling. Sotao rode up to him, her face flushed with exertion, her eyes bright. She slipped off her horse and stood before him in the snow. They had faced the fire together and had not been burned. They had stood against the world and won. He looked at her, this woman of impossible strength and courage, who had saved him, who had saved their home. All the walls, all the reservations, all the ghosts of the past crumbled to dust in that single silent moment. He reached out and gently brushed a snowflake from her hair. His hand lingered on her cheek, his touch hesitant, reverent. She did not pull away. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for just a second. It was an admission, a surrender not to him, but to the truth that had been growing between them. "You should have stayed inside," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The wind does not hide from the storm," she replied softly. "It sings with it." He looked at her, truly saw her, and realized that the hollow, aching space inside him was no longer empty. It was filled with a fierce, protective warmth that felt more real than the grief he had nursed for so long. He was no longer Nathaniel Prescott, the widower. He was Sotao's husband. And he was, finally, home. In the quiet days that followed the failed raid, a new equilibrium settled over the ranch. The confrontation had acted like a fire, clearing away the underbrush of uncertainty and mistrust, leaving the ground fertile for new growth. That night, after the last of the marauders had vanished, Nathaniel had gone back into the cabin. He walked to the mantelpiece where a small, silver-framed portrait of Mary had stood for 3 years, a silent, lonely sentinel. With gentle hands, he took it down. He did not hide it away, but polished the glass with his sleeve and placed it carefully inside the trunk with her other belongings. It was not an act of erasure, but of acceptance. He was closing a chapter, not forgetting the story. Then he turned to Sotao, who had been watching him from the doorway. "The fire is warmer in here," he said, his voice quiet. "Your bedroll should be by the hearth. This is your home now, in full." She held his gaze for a long moment, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. That night, she did not unroll her bed in the main room. She brought it into the small bedroom and laid it beside his cot. They slept in the same room, the space between them no longer a chasm of strangeness, but a quiet river of shared understanding. Winter thawed into a vibrant spring. The land, nourished by the deep snows, exploded in a riot of green grasses and wildflowers. The herds grew fat and strong. The ranch, once a symbol of Nathaniel's decay, was now a thriving testament to their joint effort. The work was still hard, but it was no longer a lonely burden. They moved in a comfortable rhythm, their separate skills braided into a single, strong cord. He taught her how to mend the more complex machinery in the barn. She taught him the names of the stars in the Cheyenne tongue. One warm evening in late spring, Chief Vokin returned, accompanied by a small party of warriors. He came not as a desperate leader, but as a father. He saw the healthy herds, the mended fences, the look of profound peace that now settled on his daughter's face. He saw the way she and Nathaniel moved around each other, an unspoken conversation in every shared glance and easy gesture. Vokin and Nathaniel sat on the porch, watching as Sotayo moved among her favorite mares. "When I left her here," the chief said, his gaze distant, "my heart was heavy. I gave my daughter to a stranger to save my people. I feared I had traded her life for ours." "She saved my life," Nathaniel replied simply, his eyes following Sotayo's every move, "in more ways than one." The chief nodded, a deep satisfaction in his eyes. "You have honored the bargain. You have honored her. You have made a home here. Kinship is a strong rope. It has held us all." That night, they all ate together at the table inside the cabin. It was filled with conversation and laughter, the blended sounds of two languages and two cultures becoming one. The ghosts were gone, replaced by the vibrant presence of life. Later, after the chief and his men had made their camp by the creek, Nathaniel and Sotayo stood on the porch, looking up at the vast, star-dusted sky. The air was soft and smelled of cottonwood and damp earth. He reached for her hand, his rough fingers lacing through hers. It felt natural, right? "I was a poor man when your father arrived," Nathaniel said, his voice a low murmur. "Not because I had no money, but because I had no future. I was living in the past, with nothing to look forward to but the sunset." She turned to him, her dark eyes reflecting the starlight. "And now?" He looked down at their joined hands, then into her face. He saw not a stranger, not a bargain, but his wife, his partner, his heart. The loneliness that had been his skin for so long had been shed, leaving behind something new and resilient. "Now," he said, a smile touching his lips for what felt like the first time in an age, "now I own 1,000 horses, and I am the richest man in the world." He drew her closer, and under the silent, watchful eyes of the Wyoming stars, he kissed her. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of quiet, profound gratitude. It was the kiss of a man who had been lost in the wilderness of his own sorrow and had been led home by a woman who knew how to stand in the wind. They had taken the broken pieces of two separate lives and built something strong and whole, a sanctuary against the harshness of the world, proving that a home was not a place you found, but a grace you built together.